You are listening to pastthink.com audiobook. Please like and subscribe, thank you. Chapter 93. A jeune retainer seeks shelter in the Jia household. And shady activities are revealed behind the iron threshold. When Feng Ziying had gone, Jiajing sent for one of the men on the gate. I see there's an invitation here from the Earl of Linen, he said. Do you know what sort of an occasion it is? I did inquire, sir, replied the servant. It's only the arrival of a new company of actors at the Prince of Nanan's. They are said to be first class, and his lordship wants to celebrate by putting on a dramatic entertainment for a couple of days. Just an informal party for friends, nothing requiring a presentation, I should say, sir. As the servant was speaking, Jiaxi came over. Will you be going tomorrow? He asked his brother. I really ought to, replied Jiajing. The Earl has always been most affable. Another servant came in from the gate and reported to Jiajing. There's a clerk from the ministry, sir, will you please go into the office tomorrow? The president has some important business for you, so could you be there a little earlier than usual? This received a brief acknowledgement from Jiajing. Two family servants came in next, whose job it was to collect the land rents from the Ronghua country estates. They paid their respects, made their kowtow, and stood humbly to one side. Are you from Hao family village? Asked Jiajing. Yes, sir. Jiajing did not inquire any further into their business. He and Jiaxi talked a little longer, and then both left for their apartments, Jiaxi accompanied by servants bearing lanterns. When they had gone, Jialian asked the rent collectors for their report. We've been as fast as we could with the 10th month rents, sir, replied one of them. They were due to arrive tomorrow, but we ran into trouble a few miles from town. Our wagons were seized by a patrol, and everything was tipped out onto the ground. They didn't let us get a word in. I tried to explain that it was rent produced for Ronghua House, not ordinary goods in transit, but they couldn't have cared less. And when I told our wagoner to keep on going, some of the highway patrol beat him up and impounded 2 wagons. I've come on ahead to report, sir. The only thing now is for you to send someone to the local yamen and demand our goods back. And you'd be doing everyone a good turn if you had those hooligans in the highway patrol brought to order. You may not know it, but the regular goods wagons have an even worse time with them. They tip out the contents and make off with them. And if the poor old wagoner dares to open his mouth in protest, he has his brains beaten out. What a preposterous state of affairs, exclaimed Jialian. He wrote a note at once and handed it to one of his men. Take this to the yamen responsible for impounding the wagons. We want our wagons and all our goods back at once. If we discover the smallest thing missing, there'll be trouble. He sent for Zhou Rui. Zhou was out, so he sent for Bridie instead, only to be informed that Bridie had gone out at midday, and had still not returned. The lazy bastards. They're never here when they're wanted. All they do from one year to the next is slack around at our expense. Shouting to his pages to find them both at once, Jialian retired to his apartment for the night. Next morning brought a reminder from the Earl of Linen. I shall be busy at the ministry, said Jiajing to his brother. And Lian will have to stay here to sort out this trouble with the rent wagons. You had better take Baoyu with you for the day. Jiaxi nodded. Very well. Jiajing sent word to Baoyu that he was to accompany his uncle to the Earl of Linen's theater party. Baoyu was thrilled. He changed and choosing 3 of his pages, Tea Leaf, Sweeper and Plowboy, to go with him, came out to pay his morning respects to Jiaxi. They climbed into their carriages and were soon at the Earl's palace. A gateman went in to announce their arrival and returned after a brief interval to escort them in. Jiaxi led Baoyu into the main courtyard, which was packed with a noisy throng. They paid their respects to the Earl and exchanged civilities with the other guests before sitting down and joining in the flow of light-hearted conversation. Before long the manager of the troupe came forward with 2 playbills, an ordinary one and a fancy one in the form of an ivory tablet, and saluting his patrons by dropping one knee to the ground Manchu style, announced, "Will the gentlemen please select their favorite plays?" Passing along the distinguished company, he came to Jiaxi, who made his choice. Then catching sight of Bao Yu, he hurried straight towards him, saluted him most elegantly and said, "Will Master Bao be so good as to choose two from our list?" Bao Yu studied his face. Those powder-white cheeks, those lips as red as rouge, that fresh luster, like a lotus on the water, that lilting gait, like a jade tree swaying in the wind, why, it was his old friend Jiang Yuhan. Bao Yu remembered having heard of his arrival in town with his own troupe. He also remembered wondering why he had still not seen anything of him. Meeting him now in such formal company, he felt unable to rise spontaneously to his feet, and had to content himself with asking, "When did you arrive?" Jiang glanced quickly from left to right, then with a confidential smile whispered, "Surely you knew I was here?" Bao Yu felt too inhibited to continue the conversation, and made his choice of plays in some confusion. When Jiang returned backstage, the guests started talking about him. He used to play soubrette parts, volunteered one of them. Now that he's older, he's given that up and turned manager. He manages the prince's resident troupe. Before that he'd already started playing young male leads. He made quite a lot of money, and bought 2 or 3 shops. But nothing could keep him from the stage, so he has turned actor manager. Someone asked, "He must surely be married by now?" "Not yet," came the reply. "He has strong views on the subject. Marriage, says he, is a once-and-for-all thing, a lifetime affair, and not to be trifled with. His bride may be rich or poor, of high or low birth, but the one thing she must possess is talent to match his. So he's remained single to this day." "I wonder who the lucky girl will be," thought Bao Yu secretly to himself, "to marry such a fine fellow." By now the plays had started. They performed in a variety of styles, the lyrical Koanchu, the noisier Gaochang and Yichang, and the clapper style from Shenxi to the west. It was a splendid show. At midday the tables were set out, and wine and food were served. After an act or two of the afternoon program, Jiaxi showed signs of wanting to leave. But the Earl came over and pressed him to stay. "The day is still young," he said, "and I understand that Bijou intends to perform a scene from the Queen of the Flowers, their piece de resistance." When Bao Yu heard this, he secretly prayed for his uncle to stay. Jiaxi sat down again. It was soon time for the Queen of the Flowers, with Jiang Yuhan playing Master Qin, the humble oil vendor. The scene in which he sits up with the drunken flower girl Jasper Lute had just the right degree of erotic tenderness, while the drinking duet was exactly as it should be, amoroso delicioso. Bao Yu hardly noticed Jasper Lute. He only had eyes for Master Qin. That ringing vocal timbre, that crystal diction, that subtle tempo were too much for his sensitive soul. He was enraptured. By the end of the performance he knew beyond any shadow of doubt that Jiang Yuhan was an artist of true feeling, and not to be compared with the common run of actors. It reminded him of a passage from the chapter on music, in the Liber Ritualis. Feeling stirs within, and is embodied in sound. When that sound is fashioned by art, music is born. No wonder true lovers of music make so much of knowing the sound, entering into the essence of the music, thought Bao Yu to himself. I must get to the heart of it. Poetry conveys feeling, but music strikes to the very core. From now on I must study it in earnest. He was awoken from this rapture by Jiaxi, who had had enough, and this time left before his host had another chance to detain him. Bao Yu had no choice but to follow in his uncle's steps. On their arrival home, Jiaxi went straight to his own apartment, while Bao Yu went to report to his father, who had just returned from the board, and was discussing with Jiao Yan the affair of the impounded rent wagons. I sent a man with a note today, Jiao Yan was saying. But the local mandarin was out. The gateman said that his master knew nothing of the affair, and had certainly never issued a warrant in connection with it. He said it was a piece of flagrant corruption and extortion on the part of the scum in the highway patrol. As this was Jia family property, he said he would have the culprits found and dealt with, and gave his personal guarantee that we would have the vehicles and goods back by tomorrow. If we discover a single thing missing, we are to report to his master and stern measures will be taken. But at present, as his master was away, he asked us as a special favor to be discreet and not bother him with it. How can such a thing be done without any kind of warrant? Said Jiaxing. You don't seem to realize, uncle, said Jialian, that this sort of thing goes on all the time. I think we shall probably have our goods back tomorrow all right. Business concluded, Jialian left the room. Bao Yu now came forward and reported on his day at the Earl's. His father asked him a few questions, then sent him on to grandmother Jia's. Jialian had not forgotten yesterday's unaccounted absence on the part of the two menservants, and on leaving Jiaxing he gave orders for a general assembly of the staff. This time there was a prompt response. After a few preliminary words of reprimand, Jialian called forward Lida, the chief steward. Fetch the general register for all household departments, and call the roll. Then I want you to write out an announcement. I want everyone to know that if I detect a single case of absence without leave, or failure to come when sent for, or negligence in any other respect whatsoever, I shall have the culprit immediately flogged and dismissed. Yes, sir, replied Lida several times. He went out and relayed this to the assembled servants, who all took due note. Not long afterwards there was an unexpected arrival at the main gate. A man in a felt hat, blue cotton gown and sturdy, leather-patched slippers approached and bowed to the janitors on duty. They eyed him up and down and asked him where he hailed from. From the Jin family in the south, was his reply. I have with me a letter from my master, which I beg you to take into Suzheng. When they learned that he was from the Jin family, the men stood up and made room for the newcomer to sit down. You must be tired. Here, sit down. We'll take your letter in for you. One of them went in to report his arrival and deliver the letter to Jiaxing. He opened it, and this is what he read. My dear Zheng, over many generations our two families have established close ties of friendship and mutual understanding. We have always looked up to your illustrious house with the profoundest respect. Although for my heinous crime 1,000 deaths would have been insufficient punishment, thanks to an exceptional act of clemency, I have been favored with a mild sentence of banishment to the frontier. In the general dispersion of our family establishment, I have a manservant called Bao Yong, who has served me well, and though lacking any particular skill, is a thoroughly trustworthy and dependable fellow. If you could see your way to employing him in some humble capacity in your household, my gratitude would be unbounded. I shall write again when I can. With sincere regards, your fellow graduate and friend, Jin Ingjia. Jiaxing smiled wryly as he reached the end of the letter. Here we are overstaffed ourselves, he mused aloud to himself, and the Jins must send us one of theirs. We shall have to try and find room for him somehow, I suppose. He turned to the gateman. Send this fellow in to see me, and find somewhere for him to stay. There must be some way in which he can make himself useful. The gateman went out and came back with Bao Yong, who prostrated himself before Jiaxing and performed a threefold kowtow. Rising to his feet, he declared solemnly, My master presents his greetings, sir. Then falling on one knee, he continued, Bao Yong offers his humble respects, sir. Jiaxing inquired after Jin Ingjia and surveyed Bao Yong. He was something over 5 feet tall, broad-shouldered and strongly built, with heavy brows and prominent eyes, a protruding forehead, a long beard and a rough, dark complexion. He stood with his arms hanging respectfully at his side. Have you been with the Jins since birth? Asked Jiaxing. Or have you only served them for a number of years? Bao Yong, since birth, sir. Jiaxing, why do you wish to leave them now? Bao Yong, it was not my wish at all, sir. But the master insisted that I should, and said that I'd find things here very much the same as with them. That is why I have come here. Jiajing, your master has not deserved the hardship to which he and his family have been reduced. Bao Yong, it is not my place to say such things, but I think the master is far too good a man, far too honest in his dealings with people. That is what has brought this trouble on him. Jiajing, but honesty is a great virtue. Bao Yong, too much of it doesn't always go down well. Some people are irked by it. Jiajing, with a smile, if that is the case, I feel confident that the Supreme Providence will see justice done. Bao Yong was about to say something when Jiajing went on. Am I right in thinking that your master has a son called Bao Yu? Bao Yong, that is correct, sir. Jiajing, tell me, does he work hard at his studies? Bao Yong, that's a very interesting question, sir. There's quite a story behind it. In a way, our master Bao Yu is just like his father, very single-minded, very, how shall I say, dedicated. His life has until recently been dedicated to playing with his sisters and lady cousins. The master and her ladyship have given him quite a few thrashings, all to no effect. A year or so ago, however, when her ladyship was away on a trip to the capital, our master Bao fell seriously ill. He had been given up for dead for a long while, in fact, and the master himself was nearly dead with worry. His funeral clothes were even laid out in readiness. In the end he recovered, thank goodness. When he came round, he said that he had been through a great archway, where he met a lady, who showed him a temple full of cabinets. And in these cabinets were a number of registers, which he saw. Then he went into a room full of girls, who turned into ghosts and skeletons. He was scared and cried out, and that was when he woke up. After this experience of his father had him treated by a doctor, and slowly, but surely he became well. This time he was indulged and allowed to play with his sisters and cousins to his heart's content. But who would have thought it, he had completely changed his ways. None of his old games appealed to him anymore. Now it was all books and studying. And nobody could distract him. He's even learning to help the master with family business. Jiajing was silent, lost in thought. Then he said, "You may go now. When we have need of you, we will find you a proper post." "Thank you, sir," said Bao Yong, and withdrew from the room. He was shown to his temporary quarters by some of the servants, and there we must leave him. A few days later, Jiajing rose early, and was passing through the main gate on his way to the board, when he noticed the porters and servants huddled together in some sort of confabulation. They seemed to be trying to attract his attention, but at the same time were evidently too afraid to speak out, and could only whisper among themselves. He called one of them over and asked, "What's going on? What's all this muttering in corners about?" "We daren't tell, sir," replied the servant. Jiajing, daren't tell what? Servant, well sir, this morning when I got up to open the gate, I found a sheet of white paper stuck to it with a lot of rude words written on it. Jiajing, what's this? What sort of thing do you mean? Servant, something about sordid goings-on at the Temple of the Iron Threshold, sir. Jiajing, show it to me. Servant, I tried to peel it off in one piece, sir, but it was stuck on so firmly that I couldn't. So I copied the wording down instead, and then scrubbed it clean. Lida has just found another one. He showed it to me, and it says much the same. That's the truth, sir. He handed Jiajing the most recent specimen. Jiajing took it and read. Jiaqin's a lucky young sod. He's in charge of the family nunnery. All those girls for just one baud. Whoring, gambling, loads of funnery. Now that rakes are running the place. Romgua House is a public disgrace. Jiajing was boiling. His head began to swim, his eyes to swirl. Telling the servants at the gate not to breathe a word of this, he gave secret orders to search every alleyway in the neighborhood for any further posters, and sent at once for Jiao Lian, who came hurrying over. "Tell me," asked Jiajing, "have you ever personally checked the arrangements made for the nuns and Taoist novices lodged at the Iron Threshold Temple?" Not personally, no, replied Jiao. That has always been young Qin's responsibility. And do you know if he is competent, or not? Asked Jiao. It sounds from what you say as though he must have slipped up over some detail, said Jiao. Take a look at this. Jiao read the poster and exclaimed. Why, this is an outrage. The words were no sooner out of his mouth than Jiao came in with a letter bearing the inscription, for the attention of Sir Jiao, private and confidential. Jiao opened it and found it to be an anonymous letter couched in the same terms as the posters. Tell Lida, he instructed them, to take 3 or 4 carts at once to the Temple of the Iron Threshold and bring all the novices back here. This must be kept absolutely secret. He is to say that they are wanted at the palace. Lida was given his orders and set off. Now when the 24 Buddhist and Taoist novices first arrived at the temple, they had been put under the surveillance of the older sisters, who gave them their daily lessons and rehearsed them in their liturgies. As the months went by and their services were not once called upon by the imperial concubine, the girls became slacker and slacker in their studies. They also began to grow up and show a greater awareness of life. Jiao himself was a bit of a young fop, and reckoned that for a pretty young actress such as Parfumée the decision to enter a nunnery must have been a childish whim. She became the first object of his advances, over at Watermoon Priory. To his great surprise he discovered that she was in earnest, and not at all willing to comply with his wishes. So he turned his attentions back to the temple, to 2 of the young novices, a Buddhist nun called Thurible, and a little Taoist nun called Crucible, both extremely attractive and much more cooperative. Many a pleasant hour they spent with him, playing music and singing songs. In the middle of the 10th month, Jiao arrived as usual with the monthly allowance. He had no intention of leaving straight away, and announced to them all. I have brought you your month's allowance. I'm afraid I shall be too late to catch the city gates tonight, and shall have to find somewhere to stay here. On such a chilly night as this, what could be better than for us to share the wine, and the few nuts and things that I happen to have with me, and make a little party of it? The girls were thrilled and immediately started putting out the tables. They even invited the nuns from Watermoon Priory to join them. Parfumée was the only one to abstain. After a few bowls of wine, Jiao suggested a drinking game. Thurible and her friends replied. None of us can play those games. Why don't we play guess fingers instead? Loser to drink a bowl, that would be great fun. It's only just past midday, objected one of the sisters. It will never do to start rioting about at this hour. I suggest we take a little drink or 2 now, and then those who wish to may leave. Those of you who want to keep Mr. Qin company can drink to your heart's content this evening. I shall turn a blind eye. Just at that moment, however, one of the lay sisters came bursting into the room. Quickly everyone. Break it up. Steward lies here, from Ronghua House. The girls rushed around tidying up, and told Jiao to hide. He was by now well in his cups and bragged. Why should I hide? I'm here to deliver the month's allowance. Lida was in at the door before he had finished speaking. Signs of the incipient orgy were all too visible, and Lida's loyal breast filled with rage. He was under the master's instructions to keep the whole operation quiet, however, and inquired with a nonchalant smile. Would Mr. Qin be here by any chance? Qin lurched to his feet. Why, Mr. Lai? What brings you here? Pleased to find you here, sir, said Lida. We must get the young ladies ready as quickly as possible, and take them back to town. They're wanted at the palace. Jiao and the girls wanted to know more, but Lida merely said, Come along now. It's getting late. We must hurry or we shall miss the gates. So they all bundled into the carts that were waiting for them, and Lida mounted his sturdy mule, and led the convoy into town. We must return to Jiao. Usually so punctilious in his attendance at the board, the master was sitting alone in his study, breathing heavily and brooding over the anonymous posters. Jiao Yan hovered within earshot, not daring to leave the house. At last there came the sound of someone at the gate, and a messenger came in to report. Excellency Zhang is indisposed, and will Sir Jing please replace him this evening at the board? Jiajing had been expecting Lida at any moment. It was most annoying to be called away like this. Jiao Yan came in. Lida didn't leave until after lunch, uncle, and the temple is over 8 miles from town. He won't be back till 11 o'clock at the earliest. As you are on call for this evening, I think you should go. When Lida gets back, I shall tell him to keep the nuns locked up, and not to say anything until you have had an opportunity of settling the affair yourself tomorrow. If Qin comes, I shall say nothing. We shall see how he reacts when you speak to him tomorrow. It seemed reasonable enough, and Jiajing left with some reluctance for the board. As soon as he had gone, Jiao Yan set off back to his own apartment, brooding as he went on what he was going to say to Shifeng. He held her to blame for having given Qin this job in the first place. But then he remembered that she was ill and relented. He had better not be too hard on her. He slackened his pace. Meanwhile, the news had spread among the servants. It soon reached the ears of Patience, who immediately went to tell her mistress. Shifeng had had a bad night anyway, and was feeling very low. Her feeble state intensified her ever-present anxiety about the various misdeeds that lay on her conscience, in particular her unscrupulous dealings at Watermoon Priory. When she learnt of the anonymous poster, she sat up with a jolt and asked Patience. What did it say? Patience thoughtlessly replied. Oh, nothing much. Something to do with the nuns at Watermoon Priory. This nearly put paid to Shifeng. Her guilty conscience spelled out for her the rest of the story. She was undone. A spasm of terror quite deprived her of the power of speech. She felt the heat surging within her, her eyes began to swim. She started coughing and collapsed on her bed, her eyes staring rigidly in front of her. Patience called out in great agitation. I meant the nuns at the Temple of the Iron Threshold. Something to do with the novices. There's no cause for you to take on so, ma'am. The words Iron Threshold brought Shifeng back to her senses. Stupid creature. Which is it, for heaven's sake? The nuns at the temple, or the priory? At first I thought it was the priory, replied Patience. Then I found out it was the temple. That's why I got it wrong just now. I thought it must have been the temple, said Shifeng. The priory has nothing to do with me. But I was the one who gave Qin the job of looking after the nuns at the temple. He's probably been making off with some of the money. No, ma'am, said Patience, I don't think it's anything to do with money. I heard the word filth mentioned several times. Well, that's nothing whatever to do with me. Where's Mr. Lien got to? He's been in ever since he heard that the master was in a rage, replied Patience. When I heard what sort of an unpleasant affair it was, I told all the servants to keep quiet about it. I hope their ladyships haven't heard. The master has sent Lida to bring all the girls back from the temple. I'll send someone out to see what's happened. Now you settle down, ma'am. You're not well and shouldn't worry your head over such things. Just at that moment Jiao Yan came in. Shifeng would have liked to ask him for more details, but thought better of it when she saw the look on his face. He was obviously in a bad mood, and she would be best advised to feign ignorance. Jiao Yan had not finished eating his dinner when Bridie came in. Lida's back, sir. Is Mr. Qin with him? Yes, sir. Tell Lida the master has had to go to the board tonight. He's to put the girls in the garden for the time being, and tomorrow, when the master gets back, we'll see about sending them to the palace. Tell Mr. Qin to wait for me in the inner library. Bridie disappeared. Jia Qin went as instructed to the library. On his way he noticed a lot of pointing and muttering among the servants. He could not make out what it was all about, but it was clearly something to do with him. This was beginning to seem less and less like a summons from the palace. He would have dearly liked to ask one of them what was going on, but felt too uneasy to do so, and could only wait there in ever-increasing suspense. When Jiao Yan arrived, Jia Qin greeted him, and stood nervously with his hands at his side. "I wonder what Her Grace requires the nuns for at such short notice," he ventured. "I had to race all the way here. Luckily I was out there anyway today with the monthly allowance, and was able to come back with Lida. But I'm sure you know all about that." "All about what?" "You're the one that should know." Jia Qin could make neither head nor tail of this, and stood there tongue-tied. "A fine mess you've made of things," continued Jiao Yan. Sir Zhang's in a fuming rage. "But I've done nothing," protested Jia Qin. "I've delivered the allowance on time every month, the girls know their services by heart." Jiao Yan could see that he knew nothing of what had happened. He and Qin had played together as children, and he sighed. "You ass. Take a look at this." He pulled one of the posters from his boot flap, and threw it in Jia Qin's direction. Jia Qin picked it up and read it. His face grew ashen pale. "Who could have done this? I've never done anyone any harm. Why should anyone want to blacken my name like this? I only go there once a month with the money, this is all lies. Sir Zhang will be very hard on me, I know he will. I shall die of shame. If my mother finds out, she'll flog me to death." He checked that there was no one else in the room, and knelt before Jiao Yan. "Uncle. Please help me. Please." He went on knocking his head on the ground, tears streaming down his face. Several thoughts were going through Jiao Yan's mind. Debauchery is Uncle Zhang's pet abomination. If he finds out that there really has been any such thing, we'll be in for a major scene. It will only help smear the family name, besides. And give the anonymous author the greatest satisfaction, and then we can expect more of such posters in the future. No, why not take advantage of Uncle Zhang's absence, talk to Lida, and hush the whole thing up? So far there's no proof that anything ever happened. And no one need be any the wiser. Having reached this decision, Jiao Yan spoke to Jia Qin again. "There's no point in trying to fool me. Don't think I don't know about every one of your mucky little pranks. Now listen, if you want to get out of this, you must deny everything, absolutely everything, no matter how hard Sir Zhang presses you. Do you understand? Now get up off the ground, you pathetic creature." Jiao Yan sent for Lida and asked him for his opinion. "As a matter of fact, sir," said Lida, "Mr. Qin was behaving in a very unbecoming manner. When I arrived at the temple they were all drinking. I'd say the man who wrote the posters was telling the truth." "Do you hear that, Qin?" said Jiao Yan. "Is Lida maligning you too?" Jia Qin was by now puce in the face and speechless with embarrassment. Jiao Yan took Lida by the hand and pleaded with him. "Spare the lad, Lai. Say you found him at home. When you take him in to see the master, there's no need to say that I've already seen him. And tomorrow you can ask the master not to bother with questioning the nuns. Send for a broker and have them all sold off. If Her Grace should really need them again, we can always buy some more." Lida reflected that there was nothing to be gained by letting the incident blow into a storm. The family's name would only suffer. So he agreed to Jiao Yan's proposal. "You go with Mr. Lai now, Qin," ordered Jiao Yan. "And do whatever he tells you." Jia Qin kowtowed once more to Jiao Yan, and followed Lida out. When they reached a secluded spot, he also kowtowed to Lida. "Excuse me for saying so, Master Qin," said Lai, "but it was your fault for behaving in such a manner. I don't know who it is that you offended. Can you think who it could be?" Jia Qin thought for a while, but could think of no particular enemies. He followed Lida listlessly out. To learn how he extricated himself, you must read the next chapter.